Hello students, so today we will be starting with a new chapter. The new chapter name is The End of Bipolarity. This chapter is present in the class 12 book of Political Science part 1, and today we will be understanding how to end bipolarity and what are the characteristics of bipolarity. You see, as I have told you in the last class, that what do you mean by bipolarity? Bipolarity means influence of the two countries, or you can say alliance of the two countries. Two powerful countries together are said to be as bipolarity. Now, what are the consequences of the bipolarity? Let us understand this one. Now, before coming into the topic, let us discuss about the USSR, the map. You see, this is USSR during the 1950s. During the 1950s, how the map looks like. You see, here, one thing, let me remind you, you can see here Ukraine. During that time, Ukraine was under USSR. That country was under USSR, but after some years, the Ukraine made its own country. And here it is the whole part of the USSR territory. Also, you can see parts of the Mongolia was also under USSR during that time. So this is the entire map of the USSR, and USSR, you can say Russia, is considered to be the most biggest country in all over the world, and also say it is the most biggest country in our Asian continent. Also during that time, Russia was not considered to be a country, the capital state during that time in USSR. USSR was completely different, but if I talk about Russia, the name came afterwards. Now how the name came, we will be understanding later on. Here you see what was the Soviet system. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, came into being after the Socialist Revolution in Russia in 1917. The revolution was inspired by the ideals of socialism as opposed to capitalism and the need for an egalitarian society. This was perhaps the biggest attempt in human history to abolish the institution of private property and consciously design a society and based on principles of equality. Now USSR. USSR is known as Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. So during that time, USSR was coming into a socialist revolution. The socialist revolution started in the year 1971. The whole country was entirely under communism, which is known as socialism. Now what do you mean by communism? It is a part of that rule of a country, which means that that only that part of the community will be ruling the whole country. Like for example, our India goes to the rulership of democracy, and some countries are there which are under the part of the monarchy, but here it is completely under socialism, or you can say communism, which means one of the whole community will be managing the entire country. This is known as communism or known as socialism. You see, the revolution was inspired by the idea of socialism. Now, the revolution, the 1917 socialist revolution in the year 1917 was inspired by the ideals of the socialism. As a result, what had happened? They wanted an egalitarian society. Now, what do you mean by the term egalitarian society? Egalitarian society means equal distribution of the property or resources in one country, which means during that time in the USSR, there was the nature of the private institution, that the private institution will be owned only by the rich people or by those people those people who have money, who has more property in comparison to the poor people. But after the socialism came into existence, the property will be distributed among all the people equally. You see, after the coming of the Bolsheviks only, the socialism came into existence. But before the coming of the Bolsheviks, most of the private property was under the richer people, and the poorer people was not enjoying those benefits. But in the term socialism, or you can say in the egalitarian society, the property or the resources will be distributed equally to all the people, among all the people. So this is the meaning of the socialism, also known as the egalitarian society. Now you see, there will be the band of the institution of private property, which means those who have private property, also those private property will be distributed among other people. Means the society will be consciously designed. It will be consciously designed so that it can provide a egalitarian or a equal society. The Soviet political system centered among Communist Party, and no other political party or opposition was allowed. The economy was planned and controlled by the state. After the Second World War, the East European countries that the Soviet army had liberated from the fascist forces came under the control of the USSR. So very, very important, you see the Soviet political party. The Soviet political party was under the socialist party, was completely under the socialism. So as a result, there was no opposition party. You see, in our country, India, there is one main party and one opposition party will be there. The ruling party will be there who will be ruling the entire country, and one opposition party will be there. But here, under the socialism, or you can say under the communism rule, there will be no opposition party. So as a result, the USSR will be entirely upon the ideals of the socialism. Now, the economy. The economy was planned and controlled by the state. The economy was planned and controlled by the state itself, which means the entire country, there is no centralized government, you can say. The entire country will be managing the own resources, and those resources they are possessing, these are all be maintained by one particular community. One particular community will be managing all the resources under that particular state. Also, after the Second World War, yes, after the Second World War, the East European countries, you see, during that time, the East European countries was under the fascist rule. Now, who has brought out the term the fascist rule? Yes, the fascist rule is just like the dictatorship rule. Benito Mussolini. So, Benito Mussolini found out the fascist rule. During that time, the East European countries was under the fascist rule. So, as a result, the USSR has gave them the freedom to come out of the fascist rule, and afterwards, those countries also came under the USSR rule. Means those countries which got the freedom from the fascist rule were under the USSR now. Also, the political and economic system of all these countries were modeled after the USSR. This group of countries was called the Second World or the Second Bloc. Now you see, the East, after the World War II, you can say after the World War II, the East European countries come under the USSR. When they came under the USSR, those countries along with the USSR is termed as the second world or the socialist bloc. Those countries under the USSR, the East European countries, were considered as the socialist bloc. Yes, the socialist bloc. You can say the Second World War or the socialist bloc. No need to mention the second world, but it's the socialist bloc. Those countries along with the USSR was considered to be the socialist bloc, which means they came under the socialist bloc, under the USSR. This all happened after the World War II. As it all happened after the Second World War, for that reason only the East European countries which got the freedom from the fascist rule came under the USSR, and afterwards those countries along with the USSR are considered to be the socialist bloc. The Soviet Union became a great power after the Second World War. The Soviet economy was then more developed than the rest of the world except for the USA. It had a complex communication network, vast energy resources including oil and steel machinery production, and a transport sector that connected its remote areas with efficiency. Now, the Soviet Union. After the Second World War, you see, as I have told you, the USA and the USSR became the most powerful countries. So, after the Second World War, the USSR along with the East European countries became the most powerful countries. And that time the economy was developing. Slowly the economy was developing, and there was transportation system was improving. As a result, oil, natural gas were also being discovered. So people were improving more during that time. The economy was developing. Also see, there was efficiency. As there the transportation system was improving, so there was efficiency. The Soviet state ensured a minimum standard of living for all citizens, and the government subsidized basic necessities including health, education, childcare, and other welfare schemes. Now, the Soviet state ensured a minimum standard of living. You see, as the economy was developing, slowly other resources were being discovered and harnessed, and they are providing the people minimum standard of living. They are providing the people minimum standard of living. As a result, subsidized basic necessities. Subsidized basic necessities, which means those necessities which are being provided by the government, and those subsidized necessities are the health, education, childcare, and welfare scheme. So, the government subsidized schemes, you can see here, health, education, childcare, and welfare schemes. So, these are also being provided to the people of the USSR during that time. Now, there was no unemployment. State ownership was dominant, such as land and productive assets were owned and controlled by the Soviet state. Now you see, during that time, before the Second World War, there was unemployment problem was there. Unemployment issue were recurring during that time. But after the World War, there was no unemployment, which means people are getting jobs. Also, you see, most of the resources which are being possessed by the state itself, these are all under the state, which means these are all controlled by the state itself. Also, they were being owned and controlled by the Soviet state, which means they are being operated and controlled by the Soviet state. Means the whole USSR only will be controlling those resources. The Soviet system became more bureaucratic and authoritarian, making life very difficult for its citizens. Lack of democracy in the absence of freedom of speech backwarded people. Most of the institutions of the Soviet state needed reform. The one-party system represented by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had tight control over all the institution and was unaccountable to the people. Now, the Soviet state. The Soviet state was becoming more bureaucratic and authoritative. Now here, what do you mean by the term bureaucratic? Bureaucratic means those resources which are under the state, means the whole country will be controlled by the state itself or by the community itself. This is known as bureaucratic. Unlike the democratic system or unlike the dictatorship system, bureaucratic is also a form of government. It is a form of government where all the resources will be controlled by the state itself, and it was becoming very authoritative as well. Authoritative means it was controlling the people. Means the whole Soviet people will be controlling by themselves and they will not be listening to the people, which means there was no freedom of speech. No freedom of speech was there. As a result, this was backwarding those people. The people were getting more backwarded. Also, there was one-party system. One-party system was there. As a result, it was creating problem for those people, for the people who are living in those areas. And also, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had tight control over the institution and was unaccountable to the people. Now, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union are having tight control over of the resources, are having tight control over the resources and the institution, and as a result they are becoming unaccountable to the people, which means people are not getting to use all those resources and institution. The Soviet lagged behind the West in technology, infrastructure, and most importantly fulfilling the political or economic aspiration of citizens. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 weakened the system even further. Now you see, the Soviet was lagging behind. In what way they were lagging behind? In technology. You see, USA was technologically advanced, and in fact the countries in the West were also technologically advanced, but USSR, they were lagging behind because the technology was not advancing. So as a result, politically and economically they were moving backward. Politically and economically they were moving backward, and also one more thing, they were not able to fulfill the aspirations of the people. You see, in a particular democratic country, the aspirations of the people are being fulfilled because this is the function of an Indian constitution, of a democracy, that we need to fulfill the aspirations of the people. But here the aspirations of the people are not being fulfilled in the USSR. For that reason only, politically and economically USSR was lagging behind. Also, you see the Soviet invasion. Now, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 weakened the system even further. In the year 1979, Afghanistan was being controlled by USSR. It was being invaded by USSR. As a result, the system was also lagging behind, which means it was backwarding. They were not improving. Though wages continued to grow, productivity and technology fell considerably behind that all of the West. This led to the shortages in all consumer goods. Food imports increased every year. The Soviet economy was faltering in the late 1970s and became stagnant. Now, wages. You see, wages are growing, productivity is also growing, and technology is also growing, but still they were lagging behind from the West. Now, though wages were there, you see, wages continued to grow. Wages continued to grow. The wages of the common people were continued to grow. Also, productivity was improving. Also, result, they were making much use of the technology as well, but still they are lagging behind from the West. As there was not much proper interaction with the West, as a result, they are lagging behind from the West. Means West are technologically advanced in comparison to the USSR. They were being lagging behind in technology. Also, you see, this led to the shortages in all consumer goods. Food imports increased every year. Now, this led to the shortages in the consumer goods. Now, in the consumer goods, there were shortages. There were no sustainability of the food. There was no continuation of the food, and food imports were increasing day by day. Food imports were increasing day by day. As a result, there was a loss to the economy. There was a loss to the economy of the USSR. The Soviet economy was faltering in the late 1970s and became stagnant. Now, the Soviet economy was faltering. It was decaying. You see, it was decaying. It was being lowering in the late 1970s and became stagnant. The economy slowly stagnant, which means there was no improvement also, there was no decreasing of the improvement also. Here, it became all stagnant. It became in a stop, which means improvement of the termination of the improvement of the economy. These are the problems that were being faced by the USSR during that time. Also, see one more thing. If I talk about the socialism, if one country is leading upon the socialism, that time the people don't have the voice to speak. That time they don't have the freedom of speech. So as a result, people aspirations are not fulfilled during that time, and the technology also the part of the economic development is lagged behind, and also the improvement is terminated. You see, after the World War II, the condition of the USSR. What happened in the USSR during that time? You see, Russia fell down after the Second World War, and the condition was very much severe. But slowly they have enhanced themselves. You can see the picture properly. These are some of the pictures. These are the old Russia. It was the pictures was being clicked during 1940s, or you can say during the 1950s. These pictures were being clicked. Now, Gorbachev and the disintegration. Here we will be talking about Gorbachev. Gorbachev was the General Secretary of the Communist Party during that time. Now, what were the contributions of the Gorbachev? You see, Michael Gorbachev. Michael Gorbachev, who had become the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1985, sought to reform the system. Reforms were necessary to keep the USSR in proper form of the information and technological revolution taking place in the West. Now, if I talk about USSR, during that time the condition of the USSR was much not proper. After the Second World War, the condition was improving, but slowly it became stagnant. It became stagnant. As a result, what had happened? Michael Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He became the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1985, and he thought of reforming the system. He thought of modifying the system to bring some changes into the system. But what had happened? Reforms, you see here it has stated about the reforms were necessary to keep the USSR in the proper form. Now, according to Michael Gorbachev, he said that it is very much important to modify the laws, to bring some reforms into one own particular country, so that there can be an improvement, and also to keep proper form of the information as well as the technological revolution taking place in the West. Now, the reforms. Why those reforms? We are considered necessary during that time, so that they can keep the USSR in proper form in terms of technology, in terms of improvement as well. Now, if I talk about Michael Gorbachev wanted to bring reforms in one particular country. But do you think he was successful at last? No, he was not successful. As a result, the term disintegration came into place. Now, what do you mean by disintegration? Disintegration means dissolution of something or falling down of something. This is known as disintegration. Though Michael Gorbachev thought of bringing reforms in one particular country, but he was unable to do it just because the people of the USSR was against it. They wanted democracy. They didn't want it socialism or communism. You see, if I talk about China, China is still under the communism form of rulership. Our India is a democratic country, but China is still under communism. Gorbachev's decision to normalize relation with the West and democratize and reform the Soviet Union had some of other effects. The people in the East European countries, which were part of the Soviet bloc, started to protest against their own government and Soviet control. As a result, the communist regime collapsed one after another. Now, as to normalize relation with the West. The Gorbachev thought of making relation with the West so that they can improve themselves. Also, they have thought of bringing reforms with the effect of the West, but the people of the East European protested against their own government. They protested against USSR. You see here Michael Gorbachev. Michael Gorbachev wanted to bring some reforms in his own country, but he failed as because the people of the East European countries protested against him. They protested against the government of the USSR because they don't want any kind of reform that will be held by Michael Gorbachev. Also, slowly, what had happened, one after another, the communist regime fell down. One after another, the communist regimes fell down, and also there was a collapse one after another. One more communist regime was coming, and another one was falling down, which means slowly everything was collapsing. Whatever being held by the Michael Gorbachev itself, everything was collapsing one after another. Now you see, these developments were accompanied by a rapidly escalating crisis within the USSR that hastened its disintegration. Gorbachev initiated the policies of economic and political reform and democratization within the country. The reforms were opposed by the leaders within the Communist Party. Now here, if I talk about the developments, Michael Gorbachev wanted some developments in his own country, but as a result, what had happened? Most of the people wanted this integration of his own government. They wanted this integration of his own government, and also Gorbachev initiated the policies and the political reform. But these are all being against by the people. He wanted to democratize, he wanted democracy within its own policy. He wanted some economic development. He wanted some political reform, but these are all being against by the people. Means the people are not accepting those reforms that are being held by Michael Gorbachev. As a result, what had happened? The reforms were opposed by the leaders within the Communist Party. Now, those leaders, whether within the Communist Party of the USSR, they are actually making the protest. They are actually protesting against its own government. They didn't wanted any communism during that time. You see here, the reforms were opposed. Here, whatever the reforms that were being implemented by Michael Gorbachev itself, they were being all opposed by the leaders within the Communist Party, which means the leaders within the Communist Party only are protesting against Michael Gorbachev's reforms. They didn't want any reforms implemented by the General Secretary. A coup took place in 1991 that was encouraged by the Communist Party hardliners. The people have tasted freedom by then and did not wanted the old style rule of the Communist Party. Now, it is 1991. A coup started in the year 1991. As a result, the people were thinking that the old style of Communist Party is not mandatory in their own country. They wanted something new. As they have tasted the freedom, as a result, they wanted something new, and they don't want the old style form of the government. They wanted something new, and the old Communist Party must be removed from their government itself. Boris Yeltsin emerged as a national hero in opposing this coup. The Russian Republic, where Yeltsin won a popular election, began to shake off centralized control. Power began to shift from the Soviet center to the republics, especially in the more Europeanized part of the Soviet Union, which saw themselves as the sovereign states. Now, if I talk about Boris Yeltsin, before it was Michael Gorbachev. Michael Gorbachev wanted some reform along with the Communist Party, but here Boris Yeltsin was against the communism. He didn't wanted any communism, and he became as a national hero. He has shaken off the whole centralized power, and he was being wanted by all the people. Means all the people wanted Boris Yeltsin. He was the former president of Russia or the USSR during that time. So power began to shift from the Soviet center to the republics, especially in the Europeanized part of the Soviet Union. Now there were reforms. Changes are developing during that time after the coming of Boris Yeltsin. You see, Soviet center to the republics. Now whatever the power was under the Soviet center, they are all going to the republics. Means slowly the country was becoming democratic. Also, as a result, Europeanized part of the Soviet Union, which saw themselves as a sovereign states. Now, during that time, though there were states under the USSR, there was not, they didn't have any control over the centralized power. The states were not given much effect. They were not given much of a kind by the central government or by the government itself. But now, the centralized, now you see the communism is converting into democracy. As the communism is converting into democracy, slowly the whole USSR, the European part of the states, are under the sovereign states. They are becoming the separate sovereign states, which means they will be having their own government itself. You see, in India we have centralized power, but most of the powers were given to the state itself. In the central government also we have our own parliament, we have our own government, but the state are also having their own government. Here also they wanted the same, they wanted democracy, which means they wanted the federal structure. Under the communism, the states which was not given much prevalence, the states were not given much prevalence, but after the democratization, means the power of the Soviet Union to the republic, slowly the states were also given much power, and they were becoming the separate sovereign states. In December 1991, under the leadership of the Yeltsin, Russia, Ukraine and Belarus, three major republics of the USSR, declared that the Soviet Union was disbanded. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union was banned. Capitalism and democracy were adopted as the basis for the post-Soviet republics. Now, in the year 1991, you see, in December 1991, under the leadership of Yeltsin, which means Boris Yeltsin, Russia is there, Ukraine is there, Belarus is there. They are all going against communism. They were all going against communism. As a result, they have declared Soviet Union to be disbanded, which means it is terminated. They declared Soviet Union to be disbanded. The Soviet Union was disbanded. The Communist Party of the Soviet, before USSR was under one communist party under the communism, but it is now terminated. It is now disbanded. As a result, capitalism and democracy came into force. Slowly, capitalism and democracy came into force, and they became the basis of the Soviet republics. Now, capitalism and democracy became the basis of the Soviet republics. The declaration on the disintegration of the USSR and the formation of the Commonwealth of Independent States came as a surprise to the other republics, especially to the Central Asian ones. Now, as there was disintegration of the socialism, as there was disband of the Union states or the communism, as a result, what had happened? It was a big surprise to the other Asian countries as well, and also to the Central Asian ones. You see, after the USSR was disbanded. The Soviet Union was disbanded. Slowly, what had happened? There was the formation of the Commonwealth of Independent States. Yes, the Commonwealth, the establishment of the Commonwealth of the Independent States, which means there will be independent states. Here, the state will be having their own government. Russia was now accepted as the successor state of the Soviet Union. It inherited the Soviet seat in the UN Security Council. Russia accepted all international treaties and commitments of the Soviet Union. Now, if I talk about Russia, Russia became the capital state of the USSR. Now, Russia became the capital state of the USSR. Now, slowly, it became the successor seat of the Soviet Union. It is now considered as the Soviet Union, means SU. It is considered as the Soviet Union, and it has inherited the Soviet seat in the UN Security Council. Now, Russia has conquered the Soviet seat. It has conquered the Soviet seat in the UN Security Council. Also, on the other hand, Russia accepted all the international treaties and the commitments of the Soviet Union. Before, long time ago, Russia was not considered to be an independent state. But after the establishment of the Commonwealth of the Independent State, Russia became the successor state as well as the capital of the Soviet Union. It became the capital of the Soviet Union, and also it has conquered the Soviet seat in the UN Security Council. It has conquered the Soviet seat in the UN Security Council, and on the other hand, what had happened? It has accepted all the international treaties. If any kind of international affairs are there, Russia will be taking part. Russia will be taking part, and they will be part of the other important discussions as well, and international affairs as well, or any trading system as well. So here you see, slowly it has disbanded the socialism, the communism. Before came Michael Gorbachev. Michael Gorbachev wanted to make some reforms along with the communism, but after the coming of Boris Yeltsin, slowly there was the disbanded. There was disintegration of the USSR. There was disintegration of the communism, the socialism, and it has converted into a Soviet Union. It has converted into a Soviet Union along with the other countries such as Boris Yeltsin, along with the leadership of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. They all went against the communism. They all went against the communism so that they can bring some reforms into the USSR as well. Also, you see, afterwards, what had happened, the Soviet Union communism was disbanded. The communism rule was disbanded. As a result, there was separate state. Separate republics were there, separate Soviet state was there, and capitalism and democracy became the basis of the Soviet Union. Before, the base of the Soviet Union was communism, but afterwards what had happened, the capitalism and democracy became the basis of the Soviet Union, of the Soviet republics. Also, you see, the declaration of the disintegration. Now, the declaration of the disintegration, before Russia was considered to be USSR, but right now it is considered to be Soviet Union. It is considered to be Soviet Union, or the whole country is considered to be Russia. Also, the formation of Commonwealth of independent state came as a surprise to the other republics. Now, before there was socialism, before there was communism, afterwards the communism was disbanded. Slowly there was establishment of the Commonwealth of independent states, which was CIS, and Russia became the powerful country during that time after having good alliance with the Western countries. I hope you have understood regarding the disintegration of the USSR. You see, it will be little bit confusing, but you have to study it line by line so that you can understand it clearly. Now, here we will be showing the pictures of the two leaders. One leader is the Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin was the former president of Russia. He was the former president of Russia who protested against communism. And here it is Mikhail Gorbachev. So the Mikhail Gorbachev was General Secretary of the Soviet Union. He was the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Soviet Union. You see, here are the both leaders. These are the pictures of both the leaders. Now, we will be understanding why did the Soviet Union disintegrated. Now, why did the Soviet Union disintegrated and what were the reason of the disintegration? Now, we will be coming into a brief. About the disintegration of the USSR. You see, the causes related to the disintegration of the Soviet Union are as follows. The economic stagnation. First, we will be understanding about the economic stagnation, the internal weaknesses of the Soviet political and economic institution which failed to meet the aspiration of the people were responsible for the collapse of the system. Now, there were internal weaknesses. Under Soviet Union itself, there were internal weaknesses. As a result, what had happened? They were unable to fulfill the aspirations of the people. They were unable to fulfill the aspirations of the people, and they were only responsible. They were only responsible for the collapse of the system. You see, under the communism, the aspirations of the people were not fulfilled. As a result, the government itself only responsible for the collapse of the system, or the communism itself is responsible for the collapse of the system. Now, economic stagnation for many years led to the severe shortages, and a large section of the Soviet society began to doubt and question the system. Now, when the economy was improving after the World War II, slowly the economy was improving, but after that what had happened? There was stagnation. There was a sudden stagnation in the economy. As a result, the people was questioning that what happened to the government. You see, after the disintegration of the Soviet state itself also, most of the changes have been developed. As a result, there were separate states. You see, during that time there were no sovereign states, because this was all under one party system, under the communism, which means under one whole community. But slowly the changes developed. They have a separate state. The Soviet economy used much of its resources in maintaining a nuclear and military arsenal and the development of its satellite states in Eastern Europe and within the Soviet system. This led to a huge economic burden that the system could not cope with. Now, you see, the Soviet Union. Why there was a disintegration of the Soviet Union? Another reason is the maintaining of the nuclear missiles. The maintaining of the nuclear missiles and also of the military arsenal. You see, during that time, war was mostly common. War was mostly common as a result to make sure to have the nuclear weapons as well as the military, to make proper maintenance of the military. Also, there was a huge economic burden. There was a huge economic burden, and also the development of its satellite states. Now, the development of its satellite states means slowly the emerging of those states. Those satellite states which were emerging in the parts of the USSR, for those improvement also, the whole USSR was under the economic burden. We can't mention USSR, Soviet Union. The whole Soviet Union was under the economic burden. Now, this led to a huge economic burden that the system could not cope with. Now, the system could not cope with. And there was the economic burden. Slowly, what had happened? The state was not, the country was unable to cope with the situation. The country was unable to cope with the situation. This has also led to the disintegration of the USSR or the Soviet Union. Again comes the political and administrative causes. Now, what are the political and administrative causes? The Soviet Union had also become stagnant in an administrative and political sense. The Communist Party that had ruled the Soviet Union for 70 years was not accountable to the people. Now, if I talk about the Soviet Union was stagnant in the administrative and political reasons. They were stagnant in the administrative and political reasons. As a result, what had happened? You see, they were not able to fulfill the aspirations of the people. Also, they were not by the people. You see, during that time, the government was not of the people, by the people, or for the people, or anything that we know about the definition of a particular government, that is the democracy. Here, what had happened, as the Soviet Union was completely stagnant in administrative and in political reasons, as a result, what had happened? The Communist Party that had ruled for 70 years was not accountable for the people. Now, the Soviet Union, they were ruling for 70 years. As they were ruling for 70 years, as a result, what had happened? They were not accountable to the people. Whatever the people wanted, they were not accountable to it. For the last 70 years, it was under the communism. It was under the Communist Party, but they were not accountable to the people. Ordinary people were alienated by slow stifling administration, rampant corruption, the inability of the system to correct mistake it had made led to the centralization of authority in a vast land. Now, the ordinary people were alienated. Though it has been said that what is the meaning of the socialism? The socialism meaning, the socialism ideal is to distribute resources among the common people, among the ordinary people. But the ordinary people voice was not heard. The ordinary people voice was not heard. As a result, you see, there was corruption, there was rampant corruption, and there was stifling administration, which means the administration was lagging behind. There was no proper working of the administration, and also the economy. There was economic burden. Slowly, economic burden was increasing, and there was no government to correct the mistake. The mistakes are also not being corrected. So here it has leading to the centralized power. The centralized power was taking over the vast land of the USSR. They are taking over the vast land of the USSR, and those were not being accountable to the common people as well. The party's bureaucrats gained more privileges than ordinary citizens. People did not identify with the system and with the rulers, and the government increasingly lost popular backing. Now, the party bureaucrats. Here you see the party bureaucrats. The party bureaucrats means those people who actually wanted who are actually the part of the communism, who are the followers of the communism. They are party bureaucrats. Now, the party bureaucrats, they were actually having all the privileges in comparison to the ordinary citizen. The party bureaucrats, who are the supporters of the communism, who are the supporters of the state itself, they were actually enjoying more privileges in comparison to those common people. So people did not identify with the system and with the rulers, and the government increasingly lost popular backing. So here people did not identify with the situation. They were unable to identify with the government, and also the government was not accountable to the people during that time. The government was not accountable to the people during that time, and also the government increasingly lost popular backing. And the government lost popular backing, which means they were not getting support from the people. The people terminated supporting the government because they were not identifying with the government, and also the government was not accountable to the government, to the people itself. So I hope so you have understood about the economic causes and the political and administrative causes of the disintegration of the USSR. I hope so you have liked my class, and if you want to know any of the courses regarding the Bhadra Academy, then you can contact us in this number 8638391721. Thank you.